"You shouldn't have been born," he said coldly. I nodded. 2 weeks later, payroll didn't process. His staff walked out. "Before we begin, grab something warm, coffee, tea, whatever feels like home. And if you've ever felt like the outsider in your own family, this one's for you." At a long mahogany dining table, beneath the soft clink of silverware and the low of idle conversation, Emily Wallace finally asked the question that had been burning in her chest for years. Her father had just poured himself a glass of wine when she looked up and said, carefully, "Dad, I think I've earned the right to be considered. Why wasn't I in the running for CO?" The room fell silent. Even Blake, her younger brother, paused mid-bite to watch what came next. Richard Wallace didn't flinch. He didn't frown or hesitate. He swirled his wine, took a slow sip, and then looked at his daughter like she was a stranger. Then, with a chilling calmness, he delivered the sentence that would stay with her forever. "You're not CEO material. You were a mistake the moment your mother got pregnant." The words hit like a slap to the face. Emily blinked but didn't move. Her mother had been gone for years, but this insult wasn't just to her. It erased Emily's very existence, dismissed her life as a misstep. Blake chuckled under his breath and leaned back, the smug grin on his face adding insult to injury. Emily sat there, perfectly still, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She had spent her whole life learning how to absorb her father's dismissiveness, but this was different. This wasn't neglect. This was obliteration. She had given everything to Wallace Manufacturing, graduated from Wharton at the top of her class, turned around 2 failing departments, cut costs by millions, created processes that doubled output, all while her father continued parading Blake, who never lasted more than 6 months in any department, as the heir apparent. "He has vision," Richard often said. Vision? Blake couldn't balance a spreadsheet if his life depended on it. Emily had hoped, naively, perhaps, that results might finally matter. That her father might see her not just as a daughter, but as a professional, a leader. She had hoped wrong. 3 days later, the company issued a press release: Wallace Manufacturing welcomes new CEO, Blake Wallace. There was no board vote. No formal transition. Just a polished photo of Blake in Richard's leather chair and a saccharine quote about honoring the legacy. Emily didn't show up to the Monday executive meeting. Her absence wasn't announced, but it was felt. The black leather chair she usually occupied third from the head of the table remained empty, its absence as cold and deliberate as the silence she now wrapped herself in. Blake made a half-hearted joke about her finally taking a much-needed spa day, and a few executives chuckled. Richard didn't even glance at the chair. He opened the meeting with his usual bravado, outlining his son's fresh direction for Wallace Manufacturing, proudly parading Blake's appointment as if it were the company's salvation. But while they patted each other on the back, Emily was nowhere near the boardroom. She wasn't at home grieving. She wasn't sulking in the shadows. She was watching, calculating. She had spent years giving Wallace Manufacturing everything she had, restructuring operations, recovering losses, building long-term growth plans that Richard took credit for without hesitation. And now, after being dismissed not just as an executive but as a daughter, she knew better than to confront him with emotion. She knew men like Richard didn't respect noise. They respected power. So Emily went silent. No emails, no phone calls, no updates on shared platforms. Her calendar was cleared, her desk untouched. Even her assistant didn't know where she had gone. It was as if she had evaporated, but behind closed doors, she was moving faster than she ever had in her life. The truth Richard had never bothered to learn, perhaps because he never thought she was worth paying attention to, was that Emily wasn't just a part of Wallace Manufacturing. She was its lifeline. Hidden behind layers of estate planning and legal anonymity was the fact that Emily, through a trust fund established by her late mother, was the primary financial backer of the company, and not in a symbolic way. She controlled 52% of the company's funding through structured capital infusions, funding that had kept the business afloat during economic downturns and expansion slumps. It had always been there, sitting quietly in the background, just like her. She had never used that authority, never flaunted it. It was her mother's legacy, and Emily had honored it with humility. But now, that restraint was over. The trust gave her full authority to continue, adjust, or immediately suspend all financial support. No board vote required. No oversight from Richard. It was ironclad. Emily had the power to choke Wallace Manufacturing at its core, and she was ready to use it. She began with the numbers. In her private home office, she contacted a trusted third-party forensic accounting team, experts she had worked with in past ventures and kept on standby. She granted them secure access to internal records, pulling data directly from the source, bypassing company channels Richard likely assumed were loyal only to him. Within days, she had the results. What she found was worse than she imagined. Blake had been signing off on large contracts with vendors that didn't exist, dozens of them. Overpriced consulting fees to shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. Inflated supply orders with no corresponding inventory. Tens of thousands bleeding out monthly into accounts that led nowhere. His digital signature was on every approval. In one particularly bold move, Blake had approved a $2,100,000 marketing campaign through a newly formed company run by one of his college drinking buddies. The campaign never launched. The company disappeared 3 weeks later. But the most damning part? Richard had countersigned several of the transactions. Whether through willful ignorance or complicit approval, her father had allowed this rot to spread. He had appointed a fraud to run the company and either didn't notice or didn't care as it began to collapse from the inside. Emily stared at the compiled reports, transaction logs, bank trails, screenshots of internal emails, and felt no surprise, just confirmation. She had always known Blake wasn't capable, but now she had proof that he wasn't just incompetent, he was dangerous. And Richard, in his blind loyalty and ego, had enabled it all. She could have ended it right then. She could have marched into the next board meeting, dropped the files on the table, and watched them both burn. But she didn't. Emily knew timing was everything. She wanted the fall to be slow, inevitable, and public. She wanted her father to feel the weight of every poor decision, every condescending remark, every time he had called her a mistake. So she waited. She instructed her legal team to pause all disbursements from the trust, citing a review clause that allowed temporary suspension in cases of financial mismanagement. Quietly, without fanfare, she turned off the tap. If you loved this story, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. Your support inspires us to bring you more heartwarming stories almost every day. Thank you for being part of our community. See you in the next one. 2 weeks passed. Inside the towering glass headquarters of Wallace Manufacturing, the mood had shifted from celebration to confusion. At first, it was little things: reimbursements delayed, vendor payments processing longer than usual, whispers from HR about a pending issue with employee health coverage. But on the 14th morning, everything cracked open at once. Not a single employee saw their paycheck land in their bank account. Direct deposits failed. Paper checks were returned. Overnight, the company's entire workforce, from senior executives to factory line workers, realized something was deeply wrong. Calls flooded the accounting department. Emails poured in from regional managers. Union representatives started circling. Vendors called to report unpaid invoices, some dating back 6 weeks. One logistics provider threatened to halt shipments entirely unless they were paid within 24 hours. Within hours, the HR director discovered employee benefits had been frozen. Health insurance access was suspended. Dental and vision coverage showed inactive on provider portals. By noon, panic was spreading across every floor of the company. The factory in Illinois, the company's main production hub, shut down operations by 3 p.m. Employees refused to work without confirmation of pay. Team leads walked off the floor. Supervisors locked the warehouse gates, citing legal liability. No one could explain what was happening. At 3:16 p.m., Richard Wallace stormed into his CFO's office like a hurricane. He slammed the door so hard the glass panel rattled. "What the hell is going on, Dan?" he barked. Dan Levinson, a man who had spent the last 20 years balancing Richard's chaos with cold precision, looked up from his screen, pale and sweating. He gestured for Richard to sit, but Richard remained standing. "Payroll didn't go through. Vendors are calling. HR says benefits are frozen. You want to explain that to me?" Richard shouted, voice rising with every syllable. Dan rubbed his temples, then turned his monitor toward Richard. "I've been trying to figure that out all morning," he said, "but it's not an internal error. The money was never transferred. The operating accounts were never funded for the cycle." "What do you mean they weren't funded?" "They're always funded. That's the entire point of the trust." Dan hesitated. Then, reluctantly, he clicked open an email and pointed to a message from the firm managing the trust account. Richard leaned in to read. As his eyes scanned the text, his face flushed. As per Provision 7.4b of the Wallace Family Trust, all financial disbursements have been temporarily suspended effective immediately, pending a formal review by the primary investor. No timeline for reinstatement has been provided. The blood drained from Richard's face. "What the hell does that mean?" he asked, voice lower now, brittle. Dan looked at him, eyes heavy with dread. "It means we've been cut off. The primary investor, the one funding over half of our operating capital, pulled the plug, and we can't touch any of the reserves without violating the agreement." Richard took a step back, gripping the edge of Dan's desk. "Who the hell is the primary investor? Some hedge fund? A competitor? I want names." Dan shook his head. "They're protected by confidentiality. It's all managed through blind legal entities, remember? You signed off on that years ago." Richard's mind raced, his pulse pounded in his ears. Someone was sabotaging him. Someone with deep pockets and perfect timing. And it had to be personal. "This is a hostile move," Richard growled. "Someone's trying to take control. This is extortion." Dan didn't respond. Across the company, things were unraveling fast. By the end of the day, 3 senior engineers had resigned. 2 regional directors followed. Operations leads were drafting notices of breach. The company's largest supplier placed a hold on all future shipments. Internal messaging channels were filled with worried employees asking if they were still employed. And through all of it, Richard refused to believe the truth. To him, this had to be the work of a greedy outsider, a corporate raider, some faceless vulture circling the company, sensing weakness and striking now that Blake was at the helm. He imagined a former investor, a rival firm, anyone but the one person he had dismissed, insulted, and cast aside. Not once did he consider that the hands tightening around his empire had once been the same hands quietly holding it together. Not once did it occur to him that the primary investor was his own daughter. The emergency board meeting was scheduled within 24 hours. Richard, red-faced and restless, had demanded it personally. He paced outside the executive conference room before it began, barking into his phone, trying to spin a narrative he no longer controlled. The entire company was unraveling, and he was desperate to find a scapegoat, someone to blame, someone to crush. By 9 a.m., the board members had filed in, all 12 of them, each carrying a copy of the prior quarter's disaster. Missing funds, frozen accounts, employee unrest. There was no denying the collapse. They had all seen it coming from the edges, but now it was at their feet. Then, the last person entered the room. Emily Wallace. She walked in without hesitation, calm and composed. Dressed in sharp black from head to toe, her presence alone quieted the murmurs. She carried no laptop, no documents, just a leather folder tucked under one arm and the kind of poise that made people sit straighter. Richard's jaw tightened the moment he saw her. Blake, seated beside him in a tailored suit too big for his shoulders, rolled his eyes with an audible sigh. Emily didn't sit at the far end of the table like she used to. She took the seat directly across from Richard, bold, uninvited, undeniable. Richard was the first to speak. "This meeting is to address the financial sabotage currently destabilizing Wallace Manufacturing," he said, voice clipped. "Someone is attempting a hostile takeover." "I'm not here to listen to conspiracy theories," Emily interrupted coolly. The board shifted in their seats. "I'm here," she continued, her voice steady, "because I am the individual who suspended the funding." Silence fell like a hammer. "I own 52% of Wallace Manufacturing through the Wallace Family Trust," she said. "A controlling interest. The funding you relied on for payroll, benefits, vendor payments, and R&D, all of it came from my shares in the trust. Shares our late mother left to me, not to you, not to Blake." For a moment, no one moved. Then Richard exploded. "You self-righteous brat," he shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "This is exactly why I never trusted you with leadership. You're emotionally unstable, manipulative, power-hungry. You'd burn down the whole company just to prove a point." Emily didn't flinch. She let the words hang in the air before replying, "No. I'm trying to save what's left of it after you handed it to someone who can't even read a balance sheet." Blake leaned forward. His cheeks flushed. "This is about revenge," he sneered. "You've always hated me. Admit it. You're doing this because Dad chose me. You're trying to destroy the Wallace legacy out of spite." Emily opened her folder and slid a stack of printed documents across the table. "I'm doing this," she said, "because you've been embezzling funds for the past 8 months." She looked at the board, locking eyes with each member. "These are records of payments Blake authorized to fake vendors, offshore shell companies. And here," she flipped another page, "are the emails where Richard signed off on those transactions without review, or worse, knowing exactly what they were." Gasps broke out. One of the board members adjusted his glasses and leaned forward to read. Another looked sharply at Blake, whose expression had collapsed into pale confusion. Richard's voice wavered. "This is fabricated." Emily tilted her head. "Would you like me to play the audio recordings of Blake's calls with those vendors? I have those too. And the wire transfers. I didn't come here to debate. I came here to put an end to the circus." The boardroom erupted in whispers and exchanged glances. The general counsel, seated near the head of the table, raised her voice firmly. "We need to pause here," she said. "These are serious allegations, and if what Miss Wallace is presenting is valid, the legal implications are significant." Emily leaned back, folding her hands. The general counsel turned to Richard and Blake. "Given the severity of this evidence and its potential to affect investor confidence, I recommend both of you step down from your positions temporarily, until a full independent investigation is conducted." Richard stood, face crimson, eyes locked on Emily with rage and disbelief. Blake sat frozen, stunned into silence. No one defended them. No one questioned Emily. The balance of power had shifted, and the boardroom knew it. The board reconvened the next morning in a closed session. The tension from the day before still hung in the air, but this time, it was laced with something new: respect. When the votes were cast and the motion passed unanimously, Emily Wallace was named interim CEO of Wallace Manufacturing. She didn't celebrate. She didn't gloat. She got to work. Within hours of the announcement, she convened a call with the finance department. Calm but firm, she reinstated payroll through an emergency trust release clause, ensuring every employee would receive back pay within 48 hours. She worked late into the night with the legal and HR teams to draft clear internal communications and begin repairing employee morale. By sunrise the next morning, she had already scheduled back-to-back calls with key vendors, some of whom hadn't been paid in over a month. She personally apologized for the delays, laid out a new payment plan, and assured them that Wallace Manufacturing was back under stable leadership. Several had already been planning to sever ties permanently, but after hearing from Emily directly, they agreed to continue the relationship. At 9 a.m., every employee across all branches of Wallace Manufacturing received a company-wide email with a subject line, "Restoring Trust Starts at the top." Emily wrote it herself: "To the people who keep this company alive, you have not been seen. You have not been heard. That ends today. Wallace Manufacturing has made mistakes, some recent, some long-standing, but we are no longer operating in shadows or silence. You deserve transparency. You deserve stability. You deserve leadership that serves, not commands. This is a turning point, and we will rise together." Emily Wallace, interim CEO. The responses flooded in. Hundreds of emails from employees thanking her for acknowledging what had been ignored for too long. Many who had resigned in protest reached out to ask if their positions were still open. Some asked for interviews. Others just sent support. 3 days later, Emily received formal notice from the district attorney's office. Blake Wallace had been indicted on multiple counts of corporate fraud and wire fraud. Investigators had confirmed the offshore accounts, the shell companies, and the trail of embezzled funds tied directly to his signature. With Emily's cooperation and the trust's financial records, the case was airtight. Blake was arrested without fanfare. No press conference. No public statement. Just a quiet booking, a mugshot, and a headline that read, "Heir to Wallace Manufacturing indicted for fraud." Richard, meanwhile, was not charged, but he didn't walk away clean. The board, following counsel's recommendation, issued a formal censure of his leadership. He was stripped of all decision-making power and reassigned as a non-voting honorary founder, a title with no authority. His office was relocated to a smaller floor. His calendar cleared. He spent most days sitting behind frosted glass watching the company move on without him. He tried to fight it at first, tried to charm individual board members, plead with old allies, but the tide had turned. Emily wasn't just a temporary figurehead. She was proving herself by the hour. Under her direction, departmental leads were restructured. The most capable, not the most connected, were elevated. Communication across branches was streamlined. Budgets were tightened and prioritized based on performance and sustainability, not ego. Within 2 weeks, Wallace Manufacturing stabilized. Within a month, it started to grow. Former employees who had walked out during the financial crisis now returned, some humbly, some proudly, praising Emily's clarity and accountability. One warehouse manager wrote her a handwritten note: "We never left the company. We left them. We came back for you." But perhaps the most telling shift came from the investors. For years, they had tolerated Richard, grudgingly, because of his name and his aggressive expansion tactics. But his recent actions, compounded by Blake's criminal behavior, had nearly tanked their trust. They had been ready to withdraw. Now, they stayed. In fact, they reinvested. Emily held private calls with every major stakeholder, walking them through the full recovery plan and answering questions with transparency her father never allowed. She didn't promise miracles. She promised integrity, and they believed her. Within a month, Wallace Manufacturing stock, once in free fall, began to climb. In every corner of the company, people were saying the same thing. Emily Wallace was the leader they should have had all along. 6 months later, the Wallace Manufacturing building looked the same from the outside: sleek glass panels, the iconic W logo etched in steel above the entrance, but everything inside had changed. Emily Wallace now occupied the CEO's corner office, and she had earned every inch of it. Her leadership had not only stabilized the company, but redefined it. Departments were thriving under merit-based promotions. Transparency was now a standard, not a buzzword. Profits were up, investor confidence was solid, and employee satisfaction surveys showed the highest morale in the company's history. And yet, one office on the lower executive floor remained dim and silent. Richard Wallace, once the commanding presence of the company, now sat behind a desk that no longer came with authority. His name was still on the official documents as founder, but no one knocked on his door for decisions. No one asked for his input. He was a relic, a symbol of what the company had outgrown. He watched the rise of his daughter with quiet disbelief. Every press mention, every new partnership deal, every article hailing her as the woman who saved Wallace, chipped away at the identity he'd clung to for decades. One afternoon, he made a call. Emily answered on the second ring. Her voice was calm, neutral. "I was hoping we could talk," he said. "Maybe lunch. Just us." There was a long pause before she replied, "All right, tomorrow, noon." They met at a quiet restaurant downtown, one he used to take clients to, back when his word moved markets. He had already arrived when she walked in, dressed in navy, every movement composed, assured. They barely made it through the pleasantries before he spoke. "I didn't mean what I said that night," he muttered, eyes fixed on the glass in front of him, "about you being a mistake. I was angry. You know I care." Emily looked at him for a moment. There was no rage in her eyes, no lingering desire for revenge. Just clarity. "I believe you were angry," she said. "And I believe you care, in your own way." He exhaled, perhaps thinking her words were a step toward forgiveness. But then she leaned in slightly and added, "You also believed I wasn't enough. And that belief shaped every decision you made about me, about this company, about Blake." Richard flinched, just slightly. "I spent years chasing your approval," she continued, "but I don't need it anymore. You taught me what not to be. For that, I'm grateful." She folded her napkin, stood, and offered a small, courteous smile. "I wish you peace, Dad." Then she walked out, heels clicking against the marble floor, never looking back. Richard remained at the table, his hands still wrapped around his untouched drink, surrounded by the silence of a man who had finally realized he'd lost something he could never buy back. Upstairs, in her office flooded with natural light, Emily stood before a wall of floor-to-ceiling windows. The city stretched out before her, full of possibility. She had been called a mistake, but that didn't break her. It built her. The story delivers a powerful message about self-worth, resilience, and rising above being underestimated. Emily represents not only intelligence and capability but also serves as a symbol for anyone who's ever been cast aside due to gender bias or family favoritism. Instead of lashing out, she chose strategic silence and fought back with strength and wisdom. The story reminds us that validation doesn't need to be begged for. It's earned through results and integrity. It's also a wake-up call to those who judge others through prejudice or personal bias. Sometimes, the mistake you dismissed is the one holding your future in their hands. And ultimately, the most powerful message is this: being called a mistake doesn't mean you have to live like one. It can be the fire that turns you into the best thing they ever lost.